Well, I will say one of the things I missed is this encounter between the pulpit and you. I have been wading in waters for 6 months on other shores, literally and figuratively. And I didn't once think about church operations because I knew they were in good hands. I didn't think about strategic implementation because I knew it was in good hands. I didn't think about pastoral care or education or the rest. I knew it was all in good hands. I thought about you and this pulpit. And when the world waded into troubled waters over the last 6 months, how I missed speaking with you about it. I missed all those important moments. Charlottesville and natural disasters and violent encounters and Confederate statues and so many tweets. Things I knew that you were wading into here, but I knew also that you were in good hands. I missed, more than most things, being able to process the events of our time, to be with you while we observed what John Oliver called a wholly depressing mess of a world. But I also knew you were in good hands. And I knew that you, like me, also felt joy and hope at times, especially together in this place. And that is why I am so happy to be back with you here after a good and whole sabbatical. The choir sang today, "Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's going to trouble the waters." And if we aren't living in troubled waters, I don't know what we are living in. But the troubled waters have deep wells of history and meaning, and I want to explore that today. There are 3 roots to the song "Wade in the Water." It comes from Exodus. You could hear the story of the Israelites escaping slavery in Egypt in the lyrics. The symbol of evil, which is held tight, the oppressive yoke over the Israelites who symbolized good, and the devotion and communities of hope that confronted the Pharaoh and his armies. The troubled waters were the waters of the Red Sea, parted for the good, drowning the evil. And in the end of this troubled water story, there are bodies of Pharaoh's army washed up on shore, saying this story at the bottom symbolizes the death of evil. It was the death of inhuman oppression and ungodly exploitation. The second meaning of "wade in the water," not entirely separate, is associated to the Underground Railroad. The story goes that the conductors that moved slaves from the violence of cotton fields and plantations in the South to safe houses in the North reminded them with the song "Wade in the Water" to throw off the hounds that chased their scent, that they had to go through the waters, that they had to be wet all the way. The song says the waters will keep you safe. And the third reference is from the reading today in John's 5th chapter. "For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool of Bethesda and troubled the water, and whosoever then first jumped in or stepped in was made whole." The story is that a man sat crippled by the fountain's edge for 38 years, waiting for someone to put him in until Jesus came and healed him and told him, "Stand up and go." It's this third meaning that brings things into view for me on this day, because wading into the water has its consequences. Wading into the water beckons us on, and on a day where we celebrate Martin Luther King, we hear the words, "Get up and walk." To not sit by the fountain waiting for some miracle to change us and our society. King himself didn't wait. He pushed on. He dragged himself and others into the troubled waters of a changing society. The ruthless poet Sonia Sanchez, in her tribute to King, in parts that followed what you have already read, my colleague, or if you've heard what my colleague has read, speaks to King's memory and says this. I want to read it to you. In our city of lost alphabets, where only our eyes strengthened the children, you spoke like Peter, like John, you fishermen of tongues, untangling our wings, you inaugurated iron for our masks, exiled no one with your touch, and we felt the thunder in your hands. And you said we must keep going, and we became small miracles, pushed the wind down, entered the slow bloodstream of America, surrounded streets and reconcentreras, tuned our legs against Olympic politicians, elaborate cadavers growing fat underneath Western hats. And you challenged us to catch up with our own breaths, to breathe in Latinos, Asians, Native Americans, white, black, gay, lesbian, Muslim, and Jews, to gather up our rainbow-colored skins in peace and racial justice as we try to answer your long-ago question, is there a nonviolent, peacemaking army that can shut down the Pentagon? And you challenged us to breathe in Bernard Herring's words, the materialistic growth, mania for more and more production and more markets, for selling unnecessary, even damaging products is a sin against the generation to come. What shall we leave to them? Rubbish, atomic weapons, numerous enough to make the earth uninhabitable, a poisoned atmosphere, polluted waters. Sonia Sanchez honors Martin Luther King and asks us to wade into the water. King urged us to wade out into uncomfortable places, and by the time he died, he had challenged the very heart of our mania for more and more violence. I asked myself today in preparation for this sermon, could Martin Luther King have imagined us and what we are going through? We who 50 years after his death have made so many strides in civil rights and also lost so many battles in the hearts of Americans to change. We who have let our materialistic mania grow like a wild weed. We who have let our sin against a generation widen with every denial of climate change and every appointment of a ridiculously unprepared servant in our administration. We who have let our dignity as our country weaken with every name-calling of another country and every group of innocents sent home to countries they have fled. We who see our failure to live up to our ideals that we are a country of opportunity for all and look more like a country that gives handouts to those who already are at the top of the peak and spurn the poor for their bad decision-making. We who have hope, which diminishes with every stride toward combating prejudice when Nazis and white supremacists come out of their hiding and spit violence and division upon our communities. Would MLK recognize us? King, in a sermon in 1956 at the Cathedral of St. John of the Divine in New York City, celebrating the 2-year anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, said, what we are seeing now in this struggle is a gradual victory of the forces of freedom and justice. The Red Sea has opened, and today most of those exploited masses have won their freedom from the Egypt of colonialism and are now free to move toward the promised land of economic security and cultural development. As they look back, they clearly see the evils of colonialism and imperialism dead upon the seashore. In our own struggle, he said, for freedom and justice in this country, we have gradually seen the death of evil. Many years ago, the Negro was thrown into the Egypt of segregation, and his great struggle has been to free himself from the crippling restrictions and paralyzing effects of this vicious system. Was King hopeful that those changes were happening, or was he just naive? Because in retrospect, what we see is that while laws changed, attitudes did not. In retrospect, divisions were addressed, but borders were firmed up following civil rights. A once progressive South politically became the heartbeat of conservatism since the late 60s. Our divisions are firming up in areas of class and race, and yes, by the Mason-Dixon line. And these three are more dangerous divisions than we have seen in our society for a long time. Once upon a time, the North-South division was designed to imprison the black man and woman in a system of exploitation in the South so the North could reap benefits in its factories and its mills. Now, the divisions of North and South are political, aimed to disenfranchise, to divide us against one another. I fear more than ever these differences between South and North widen, and I say this having lived just in the North and having lived in the South. As I drove from Boston to South Carolina for Christmas last month, I saw the dividing line, which is just north of Richmond, Virginia, the old Confederate capital. Someone was stating it very clearly that we had crossed a border because the flags of the Confederacy were flying along Interstate 95 as big as any flag you have ever seen. I noticed the proliferation of anti-evolution billboards and signs that indicated who was a true American, and judgy religious signs we take in stride here, appearing the further south I went. The divisions mean to me that attitudes are hard to change, that we are actively being pushed away from each other. I spent a little time at the Media Lab or the Innovation Lab at MIT in conversation about religion and technology during my sabbatical. Very smart people, as you imagine, with access to massive amounts of data. In this case, they own and they can look at every tweet ever created, and they can analyze them for divisions. I'm not kidding when I talk about Twitter as it. One young man, whose name was David, was looking at north-south divisions based on interpretations of words in Twitter. He found, in short, that we are speaking a different language. Words like meaning in the North were associated with education, in the South with gratitude. Words like earth in the North were associated with climate and economy, in the South with a religious heaven and earth. Words like education in the North were associated with technology, in the South with debt. Words like tide in the North were associated with weather, in the South with football. The point is that the divisions in language mean the divisions are real, and that attitudes are hard to change. The civil rights movement was trying to erase divisions, and since then we have shored them up like nobody's business. You see, we think of the civil rights movement sometimes like it went really well. We make it sound like one day Rosa Parks sat on the bus, on day 2 King led a march in Washington, on day 3 racism was over. But we never ended the attitudes that came from an era inherited in the blood and tears and terror for people of color that forged our economy. We did what we could. We did lots of important changes, but not on attitudes. We sat by the fountain waiting for someone to throw us in. At best, we waded into the water, but we didn't get very wet. As a side note, I decided to infuse each sermon I give over the next 4 sermons with one class I took at Harvard during my sabbatical. I'm really struggling with how do I share this with you. This sermon is informed by the class I took with E.J. Dionne. You know him from NPR and the Washington Post, on politics and religion in America, that circled back so many times to Martin Luther King and civil religion and what contributed to our current time. Dionne said when MLK arrived at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, he told them in a letter that he wasn't going to be political because the previous minister had been fired for being too political. Dionne taught us to think about King as having been pulled deeply into this work, like thrown in the fountain, and becoming Jesus' extremist for love, Dionne's words. That King worked toward the promise that all Americans would have life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, a promise that America had defaulted on. E.J. taught us that King said that moderates are concerned with order and radicals are concerned with justice, that the issues of economic justice and voting rights and disparity in service in Vietnam pointed to a system that required our attention, and that MLK's message, especially to white America, was, and I quote, "I'm not calling you to be something you are not, I'm calling you to be something you ought to be." King pulled us into the troubled waters. In the class, we explored King's legacy, his narrative, and the metaphor of his life that concluded in the thought that he was part of a new Reformation. The scriptwriters couldn't write it any better. He was the new reformer for the world, and his name was Martin Luther. The original sin of slavery was supposed to be washed away by the Civil War and the 14th Amendment and emancipation, but we failed that redemption with segregation and Jim Crow, to which the civil rights movement was supposed to reform and redeem us, led by the new reformer, Martin Luther. Through Martin Luther King, we get a second take at Reformation, and then what happens? He is crucified. The reform makes change, but attitudes are never fully changed. And so years later, we have Ferguson and countless shootings of black men live on YouTube, and Charlottesville, and the rise of now unhooded white supremacists this time. We have a country that seems to be led by vindictive policies to the poor, which takes away protections, which supports the riches in a trickle-down theory, which removes environmental protections that affect those who can't escape the floods and the dirty air. What we need is a new reform movement, a third take at redemption, and I think we are in that moment. Our hope is changing the narrative that many of us got a glimpse of on Friday night at Temple Emmanuel with Reverend Barber, who reminded us that the only answer to the absurd and vile attack on our democracy and society is to ask not whether the American dream is possible, but whether America is possible. And then what are we going to do about it? Are we going to get radical? Are we going to be extremists for Jesus and wade into the waters to heal us all? Will we become repairers of the breach, as Barber says, with moral leadership, and declare a moral public concern about how our society treats the poor and women and LGBTQ people and children and workers and immigrants and communities of color and the sick? He says our traditions point to equal protection under the law and a desire for peace and dignity for all. That is the new Reformation that we should be joining. The new campaign for the poor in America. And I got a glimpse into the new Reformation movement when I heard Brian Stevenson a month or so ago at First Unitarian Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Stevenson is a Harvard Law grad and has worked on the death penalty. He is now trying to shine a light on the history of lynching in America. His movement says that to create a just society, we can't be governed by fear or anger, nor can we give in to shame or shy away from our troubled past. He says we can have hope if we do four things. If we think about our identities and root them in conviction. If we get close to issues, not just talk about them. If we stay hopeful that the hopelessness we experience is the enemy of justice. And four, if we get uncomfortable. We have to wade into the troubled waters. Stevenson said to those of us gathered at First Unitarian in Cambridge, a very comfortable crowd, he said, whenever has injustice ended when people were comfortable? Never in history has inequality changed and everyone was sitting around feeling good about themselves. Stevenson told us a story about when he was a kid in church. He learned that lesson very clearly. As like an 8 or 9-year-old boy, he was standing in the church fellowship, and a little boy who was same age as he was said something and was a stuttering child. And Stevenson laughed at the boy. And his mom took him aside and she chewed him out like any good mother in church should do. And she said, you go back and you say you're sorry to that boy. And so he begrudgingly, shuffled his feet over to the little boy and sort of mumbled that he was sorry to him. And then he went back to his mom, and his mom said, okay, now you go back and you give him a hug. So he kind of begrudged, and he went over and he gave him a hug. And then he went back to his mom, and his mom said, now you go and you tell him you love him. Hard to do, but he went over and he said, I love you. And the boy said, I love you too. Stevenson said in so many words, if we're going to wade into the waters, if we're going to honor Martin Luther King, we have to be like that little boy, willing to risk a lot, willing to put ourselves in the way of pain and shame and hurt and enter the waters troubled by God with love in our hearts and never give up. Friends, our work is cut out for us. Good intentioned, thoughtful, compassionate people that you and we are. Attitudes must change in our world. Divisions must be healed. Bridges must be built. We need to be able to look into the eyes of our enemies and say, we shall overcome this turbulent time and we will do it together. We have to be able to say to everyone we know, we love you. Not just to the people who share our Twitter feed or like the words we like. King's final words in his 1956 sermon were like his final words in his 1968 sermons. While so much changed for King and his commitment to changing the systemic nature of oppression in our world, the one thing that stayed the same was his hope in each of us. He said, let us not despair. Let us not lose faith in man and certainly not in God, he said. We must believe that a prejudiced mind can be changed and that a man, by the grace of God, can be lifted from the valley of hate to the high mountains of love. Let us remember that as we struggle against Egypt, we must have love, compassion, and understanding, goodwill for those against whom we struggle, helping them to realize that as we seek to defeat the evils of Egypt, we are not seeking to defeat them, but to help them as well as ourselves. Friends, may King's words ring true for us today, which we give to him, but tomorrow is for each of us and a society that needs us. May we be emboldened and hopeful and joyful, even in the face of despair, for surely others have faced worse. Others have persevered with courage through harder times. May we do it with love in our hearts and compassion by our sides. I love you, friends. It's so good to be back in this dialogue with you. Amen and amen.